South Sudan won its independence in 2011 in a landmark referendum ending a 6.5-year interim period following the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005. Drawing decades of intermittent civil war to a close, the country was euphoric, reveling in pride, nationalism, and increasing prosperity. While development remains slow, internal conflict and intertribal clashes have decreased significantly, and resources have become more widely accessible. Over the past 4 years, South Sudan has established a fundamental governing sector comprising of executive, judicial, and legislative branches that have begun to introduce incentives, laws, and have started to perform the country's core functions. Due to the legacy of conflict and neglect, socio-economic development in South Sudan is at a bare minimum, despite a nominally high average income as a result of the large oil industry. As a result of such new development, the health, education, and food security indicators remain closed, and in the absence of infrastructure and limited transport facilities, the majority of the population is without access to social services. Defined as a state with typically low income and is particularly vulnerable to crisis as a result of lack of state capacity or lack of state legitimacy, state fragility is a complex and many-headed beast, its tentacles reaching far and wide to entrap countries all across the globe. A nation, a group of people that identify together, speak the same language, or are of the same ethnicity, is often confused with the terms state and country, these two being used interchangeably and applying to self-governing political entities. A nation-state combines the two terms, referring to a form of political organisation in which a group of people who identify together, speak the same language, or are of the same ethnicity, live in a particular area under one government. The fragility assessment and South Sudan's subsequent challenges. To address the causes of its fragility and establish a path towards resilience and economic recovery, South Sudan's fragility assessment of 2014 has highlighted 5 crucial sectors in the developing country and how they are at the heart of South Sudan's incapability of long-term development. The first sector is titled Legitimate Politics and refers to the successfulness of central and internal political institutions. Examples of South Sudan's challenges within this area are the sustainable implementation of internal peace initiatives, in particular in the Jonglei region, as 74% of all conflict-related deaths occur here, developing a smoother transition and integration into international organisations, and increasing women representation in political and civil services, as women only held 23 out of 132 state minister posts in 2011. The second section is labelled Security and outlines the fundamental security standards of any recognised state. Within this category, South Sudan hasn't been able to maintain substantial border control as 200,000 unwanted refugees increase pressure on South Sudan's facilities. Poverty and inequality continue to fuel conflict as 51% of the population live below the international poverty line, and domestic violence continues to impinge on security within the home. Data showing that 45% of South Sudanese regularly fear crime in their own homes. Economic foundations are undoubtedly at the heart of development, and therefore the fourth section of the assessment summarises the core issues in South Sudan's economic recovery. Low economic diversification resulting from 90% of South Sudan's revenue deriving from oil, an underdeveloped agricultural sector with 4.5% of arable land cultivated, and how 77% of the working age population have never attended school, outlines how South Sudan's economic situation is currently failing. The final sector, revenue and services, outlines the division of resources and the capacity of local services. Fragility within this sector derives from corruption and impunity of revenue collectors, relations between the state and local levels remain suboptimal, and how government spending on social sectors remain limited. Is state failure dangerous to the world? Since the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States, in the words of President Bush, the US is threatened less by conquering states than we are by failing ones. Undoubtedly, the greatest threats to America in the upcoming years will derive from failing states. However, the truth is that only some state failure poses a real danger to the Western world. A primary example of this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where 5 million or more have died in the wars that have enveloped the country since the 1990s. The situation has been one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, and yet what has been the consequence to the Western world? It is hard to argue that there has been much impact apart from the change in the cost of coltan, a material mined in the Congo used to make mobile phones. Even global terrorism caused by states has been overstated, as terrorism is only an issue in failed states with a significant Muslim population. But the relationship between fragility and global terrorism is less influential than we believe. Islamic militants in failed states such as Chad or Somalia have only proved a minimal threat to the world outside their borders and have only imposed fear in their citizens. Countries such as Pakistan or Yemen, that are ongoing threats to Western civilization, have a somewhat functional government with more internal political control and is significantly more competent than failing states. Scholar Stuart Patrick supports this argument, concluding that a failed middle-ranking group of weak but not yet failing states, for example Pakistan or Kenya, may offer more long-term advantages to terrorists than either anarchic zones or strong states. Another example is the three prominent players within the world of transnational crime: cocaine growers in Latin America, traffickers in West Africa, and users in Europe. They have all adopted considerably weak Western African countries with unpatrolled borders, weak security forces, and open ports as transshipment points for their illegal produce. Drugs are dropped out of planes or shipments are unloaded just off the west coast of South Africa into countries such as Guinea or Sierra Leone, ready to be shipped north. However, the operational point of these crimes are all based in countries like Ghana or Senegal, who boast reliable banking systems, transport connection, and many opportunities for illegal activity. It is further claimed that states are dangerous due to the fact that they are ungoverned spaces. This isn't necessarily true. In states such as Somalia, anarchy is a result of the lack of internal political control, but on the contrary, in countries such as Sudan, Sudanese violence is a consequence of state policy and the deployment of national armies interrupting the lives of citizens. Who creates the index of failed states, and what classifies a state as weak, and what is the importance of it? The Fund for Peace organisation and the magazine Foreign Policy have been annually assessing state failure since 2005. It ranks 178 countries based on their levels of stability and social or economic pressures in order to create the data. In order to create the data, three primary sources are used, an example being the Fund for Peace's Conflict Assessment System tool, referred to as CSAT. Furthermore, 12 primary social, economic and political indicators, each containing 14 subcategories, guide further judgment on the stability of a country. CSAT software analyzes information collected from the indexes using technology that flags relevant terms. This is then converted into a score representing the significance of the various pressures within that indicator for that specific country. In order for a state to be labelled fragile or weak, they must have the following characteristics: loss of territory control, erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, inability to provide public services, inability to interact with other states or not be a beneficial member of international organisations. By creating a fragility index, the FFP claims to develop ideas for promoting a more stable and functional world. The index should spur conversations, promote political debate, and provide a general guideline for strategies for sustainable security. There is much controversy surrounding the anomalies, but due to the amount of indexes, some countries couldn't provide data for all. Aid and other such support may be increasingly provided for failed states. However, investment may be reduced due to recognition of their fragility. History of the issue. Many states do not fail with a bang, but spiral downwards over a long period of time, subjecting citizens to a life of poverty and human rights violations. A weak central government, political exploitation, minimal law enforcement, and inefficient public services are just examples of the many causes of state failure. A weak central government in countries such as Colombia results in the inability to effectively control its entire territory. Furthermore, a large-scale economy cannot function efficiently without public confidence, a legal framework, or access to basic public goods. Regarding political exploitation, a primary example being Bolivians rebelling against land and mine workers, revolutionary movements overpower political authorities. Public services such as infrastructure to facilitate transport is crucial to development and improving the overall standing of living in a country, consequently eliminating uncertainties and violence. Imperialism occurs when a dominant power overruns neighbouring states politically, economically, and socially through violence. Stable economies, governments, armies, and job sectors were provided by the mother countries, allowing the colony to establish infrastructure as imports and trade heightened. A primary example of this was the significant increase in rare mineral mining, which to this day remains one of the core sectors of the South African economy. However, with the imperial influence came diminishing nationalism, increasing tribal tension as a result of territorial restrictions, and the degradation of African tradition. The economic impact brought around by imperialism was great, a primary example being the boom of the Atlantic slave trade. Introducing sophisticated systems of credit and exchange, the trade dated back 300 years prior to African colonialization. In order to fulfill the demand of Europe, Africa exploited natural resources, including slaves, further building on their economic dependency. It became a common goal of the colonies to reach the demand of the dominating country with the lowest possible cost. After World War I, colonial systems were dismantled in a process called decolonization. It refers to the unravelling of empires and the claim of formerly colonized people to independence and self-determination. Two major occurrences brought around decolonization: independence movements in colonized territories and economic decisions made by colonial powers. The cost of maintaining the colony began to outweigh the economic benefit of the country, resulting in many colonial powers abandoning the economy or giving into the independence movements. As a result of this, newly independent African states had to develop their own economic system, government, and social standing. From this developed African state fragility. During the Cold War, the world was bipolar with two leading central powers, Russia and the US. After the Cold War, a hegemonic world was created with the US at its centre. The Soviet Union and the US exploited economic and social tensions in order to compete at the highest level, resulting in tensions between the leading global superpowers, which are still present today. In Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War introduced an era of economic growth and a large increase in the number of liberal democracies, while in other parts of the world, such as the Middle East and Africa, independence often led to political disintegration and state failure. The states turned chaotic with an inability to lead and organise the foundations of an efficient country. Fragile states erupted from the realisation that the communist economic system didn't work, as the Soviet Union was falling further and further behind, as they couldn't produce the weapons or satisfy consumer demand. A primary example of this is the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, resulting in Afghanistan dissolving into the failed state it is today. Human rights and terrorism. The concept of human rights has a range of potential applications in conflict situations and weak institutional environments. In warfare zones or wherever civilians are at risk, there is a definite violation of human rights. One of the principal human rights is that they are globally valid, regardless of state failure. Human right number 21, the right to democracy, is a common issue in many failed states, as control derives from an efficient government, and without it, the country falls into anarchy. Furthermore, many state citizens in failed states have minimal access to food and shelter, as the country can't provide the bare essentials. Without social services, education becomes inaccessible, potentially resulting in a failed economy. A key issue to be addressed is to what extent the sovereignty of a failed state poses an obstacle to international engagement. A primary example of this is Haiti, where President Preval expressed frustration about Haiti being supposedly bypassed by relief efforts and aid. This therefore has significant impacts on the rest of the world. Through the NGO supplying the relief aid, the contributors working with the NGO, and the interstate relations regarding Haiti. The UN's actions attempt to relieve ethical issues within fragile states. However, communication between authorities, infrastructure, and acquiring the correct information on what is necessary proves this a demanding task. There are numerous factors that contribute towards terrorist intervention in failed states. With virtually free-reigning countries with significant tribal areas or minimal government control, terrorist organizations have relatively easy access to land. As a result of the growing centrality of fragile states to global security, countries such as Syria are being referenced as a more influential threat. Violent conflict has seen the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant seize and operate with impunity in vast swathes of land in northwestern Iraq and eastern Syria. This was due to a lack of internal political control, command of territory, and strategy of military forces. Approximately 30,000 nuclear weapons capable of killing hundreds of thousands of people are accessible worldwide today. As a result of this ongoing threat to humanity, a 4-decade-old organization called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty stands for the prevention of using nuclear weapons and weapons technology. Fragile state members such as Iraq and Syria have today or in the past pursued weapon programs in violation of their treaty obligations. In consequence, some experts perceive it as the era of a second nuclear age, indicating the possible danger and tremendous consequences of fragile states being in possession of such nuclear technology. South Sudan and many other fragile states have a greater impact on neutral states than one might initially believe. The newspaper, the Local CH, has recently released an article covering the ISIS video that encourages terror attacks on Switzerland. This video promotes jihadists to launch a fresh round of life-threatening attacks throughout Europe. There will be more and more operations like the recent one in all of Europe, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and Switzerland, everywhere in Europe and everywhere in America, Allah willing, states an unidentified ISIS member to the camera. This demonstrates the significance of the present terrorist threat to the international community. Posing as a threat to both the country's citizens and the world, state fragility is undoubtedly one of the most prominent rising issues facing the 21st century. Due to an increase in weapons technology and the rise of extremist religious organizations, acts of terrorism and violations of human rights are occurring much more frequently. Interstate organizations such as the UN are attempting to resolve and reduce the implications of state fragility. It is these types of organizations that will prove the solution to state fragility and in consequence improve the living standards of many, increase international security, and reduce international tension.